I'm going to make an executive intervention and ask the Loeb Fellowship curator to find a seat. This is the one thing about the Loeb Fellowship, you can't stop them from talking. So tonight it might be quite difficult to actually end this evening, I think, given that so many Loebs are here, which is amazing to see you all. Thank you for coming and supporting the fellowship. So welcome to the GSD. My name's Oliver Wainwright. I'm the architecture and design critic of The Guardian newspaper based in London. And this year I'm a Loeb Fellow at Harvard. Woo! Hopefully tonight will be just as explosive as the emoji in our logo. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers for you. I should welcome our online audience and also say hello to the architects, libel lawyers who might be watching this in replay. Everything said tonight is an opinion, I should hasten to add. No statements of fact will be made. Firstly, thanks to the Loeb Fellowship team, to Jim, to Susan, to Rosanna for making tonight possible, to Sarah and Matt from the GSD's amazing events team who put on something like this practically every evening, and to Nicholas and Joel from MIT's architecture department, because tonight is a rare collaboration between Harvard and MIT, hopefully the first of many such events between the two schools. Now, the reason I was so keen to arrange tonight is actually the first reason I ever had to come to the GSD was when I was invited for quite a similar panel back in 2015 by Dean Mostafavi, which was called Writing Architecture. Featured Christopher Hawthorne, Florencia Rodriguez, and the late great Michael Sorkin. I was just in New York with one of our speakers, Thomas, and we went to see the Sorkin show, which really brought back memories of quite what a kind of powerful and sage-like figure he was. 3 years after this event, he said, "The critic's duty is resistance. As the country careens toward full-on fascism, its environment assailed and warfare looming, we must defend the social architectures of civility and not lose ourselves in the artistic weeds," which I think is probably a position most of us tonight would still try and uphold in our work. Fascism. We've got the fascism, it's true, and the warfare. He predicted pretty much everything. This is the reason that brought me back here 11 years later as a Loeb Fellow. Just a brief bit about the fellowship. It was founded by John and Francis Loeb in response to the GSD's Capital Campaign, which was launched in 1968 with this momentous publication, Crisis, which you can still find in the Loeb Library special collections. The manifesto was written to address, quote, "the chaos in our cities, the loss of control over our environment, and the urgent need for leadership for the future." So their ambitious plan was that if you get 10 mid-career professionals who work in the built and natural environment, bring them to Harvard every year, and then miraculously these problems will be solved. I'm pleased to say that 55 years later, we're still working on it. And this is some of the cohort that I'm lucky enough to be fellows with this year. I would say that our problems now are slightly different and maybe even more dangerous than they were back in the 60s. You are led by a developer-in-chief, a president who is perhaps more interested in the power of architecture and development than any other president since Jefferson, I would argue. A man determined to leave his mark on DC, whether it's in the form of triumphal arches or gigantic ballrooms. Not content with reshaping DC, he has plans to shape other parts of the world with these genocidal smart cities. At the same time, we have a president who I think most of us probably assumed was a bit more reticent, building a kind of fortified obelisk to himself on the south side of Chicago. This is the Obama Presidential Center, due to open in June, which has been appropriately nicknamed the Obamalisk. So how, as architecture critics, are we to make sense of all this? For some inspiration, I went down to the good old Loeb Library, to the architecture criticism section, and found this very promising book, Constructive Criticism in Architectural Design, hoping that it might have some answers for tonight. It turned out to be possibly the slimmest volume in the entire collection, which I hope is not a reflection of our profession. So, with us tonight to answer these questions and more, we have an all-star cast of critics from across the US. We're going to begin with Mark Lamster, all the way from Texas. He's the architecture critic of the Dallas Morning News, Loeb Fellow 2017. He's the author of the biography of Philip Johnson, the man in the glass house, gives amazing tours of 9 Ash Street, if you can grab him. His next book is on the architecture of Dallas, Welcome to Paradox City, coming out in August. After Mark, we're going to hear from Alexandra Lange, who is a columnist for Bloomberg CityLab and Loeb Fellow 2014. You see the recurring pattern here. She won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism last year, and she's the author of Meet Me by the Fountain, an inside history of the mall, as well as the design of childhood, how the material world shapes independent kids. After Alexandra, we're going to hear from Thomas de Monchaux, who I promise you is not a Dickensian ghost, but a real-life human being. Or maybe he is a Dickensian ghost. He's an architect and writer based in New York. He's the critic for N+1 and essayist in residence for the New York Review of Architecture, as well as co-author with Deborah Burke of Transform, Promising Places, Second Chances, and the Architecture of Transformational Change, as well as teaching at Columbia University. After Thomas, we will hear from Anjulie Rao, who's come all the way from Chicago tonight. Her bylines can be found in Architect Magazine, Dwell, the Architect's Newspaper, the Architectural Review, and many more. She's currently plotting the new Chicago Review of Architecture, which is a new publication about to emerge. She's also a lecturer at the School of Art Institute of Chicago and an adjunct faculty member at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And last but not least, coming even further from Los Angeles, we have Mimi Zeiger, an LA-based critic and curator. She's served as guest editor and editorial advisor to the Los Angeles Review of Architecture, co-curated the US Pavilion at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennial. She's a McDowell Fellow and recipient of the LA Press Club National Arts and Entertainment Journalism Awards for Art and Design Criticism. Now, I've gone on for way too long. These guys are each going to have about 7 minutes to give you their provocation. Then we're going to move over here, so please be thinking of questions and challenges that you want to put to them in that time. So, over to Mark.
I should also add, we celebrated Alexandra appropriately. That's awesome. But also, just this last week, Tomas, our wonderful panelist Tomas, was nominated for a National Magazine Award. So how about a hand for architecture criticism? The good news is you're all here and so happy and engaged and excited to be talking about architecture criticism. Unfortunately, this is in what most people think of when they hear the name architecture critic or the profession architecture critic. Of course, this is Ellsworth Toohey, the sort of evil character from the film, what the hell's the name of the film? Fountainhead, thank you, sorry. The sort of all-powerful snob, effete, and in fact, I think this is kind of the general public's idea of what an architecture critic is. It's also what most newspaper editors think an architecture critic is. They don't really think we need this. It's just some guy who's, going to talk about super esoteric things like, the proportions of the architrave and have nasty opinions. And for newspaper editors, they don't really see why they should have someone like this on staff, or magazines, newspapers, whatsoever. So this is sort of the challenge we architecture critics face, is convincing people that what we do is really important for their readers. Now, I know there are a lot of architects in here and they're laughing at this presentation of what an architecture critic is, but the bad news is this is what they think you are. Similarly, the sort of effete person, possibly European, who wears all black and sort of works for designing things for incredibly wealthy people. And that's not really speaking to people's everyday lives. And so again, what's essential for both the critic and for the profession is having somebody, I think, who can explain why what architects do, and some don't even dress this way, are important. And the problem is that people are resistant. And here's an example of just how problematic it is to get people to care about architecture. So who here is familiar with the TED Talk? I'm guessing everybody, right? They're kind of annoying. But a few years ago, some guy gave a TED Talk about how to make a successful TED Talk. And what he did was he went through all TED Talks in history and singled out the themes that were most popular in the popular TED Talks that were well received based on whatever metrics they use. And you can see here the themes that were most popular, like happiness and all this kind of stuff. Who here would like to take a crack at what the least popular theme of the least popular TED Talks would be? Anybody? Bingo. It gets worse. It gets worse because if you keep looking, you'll notice that the next thing is media. So basically, architecture criticism, and then, sorry, Ali and Tomas, architecture criticism by men. So there's an uphill battle that we face. So the question is, how do we deal with this? And that's the challenge we face. And I think the answer is not just talking about these sort of trophy buildings and the people who build them, but really thinking about the built environment more broadly, about how cities work, about how the places that we inhabit really shape the way we live our lives every day. And this is a project, I undertook. A collaborative project actually with Chris Reed, who I'm not sure if he's here, from Stoss Landscape Architecture, and Monica Ponce de Leon, looking at Dealey Plaza in Dallas and trying to rethink that space, which functionally does not work. It's quite dangerous. And I would argue as a memorial space is also not functioning the way it should be. And we sort of created this project to rethink how that space would operate. And it really engaged the public with an innovative way of looking at a place that's really important to them. And this got a lot of attention, actually ended up in the Chicago Biennial this year, which was really rewarding and fun for me, especially because Chris did most of the work. I do, however, love talking about signature architecture, about important buildings in the landscape. This is Dallas City Hall, which at the moment is a great debate in Dallas about what's going to happen to this project. Many in the city want to see it replaced with a new arena built for the Dallas Mavericks, who are owned by an evil billionaire from Las Vegas who thinks Donald Trump should have a third term. So much of what I've been writing lately is about the efforts to save Dallas City Hall. So as you can see here, some recent stories just trying to explain to people why a building that they might not ordinarily love, this work of very forceful brutalism, is something that really should be saved. And it's been a really difficult and rewarding project to try and get people to believe in this building and save it. We had a story up here in the morning news about this actually this morning. It was too late to get it in this slide presentation, unfortunately. But there's finally, I think, a little hope where it seemed like there was none. So this is a lot of what I'm writing about these days, and as Ali mentioned, have a new book coming out there. You can see the building on there. And this is another way I'm trying to think about writing about the city. And this book is I'm calling it a critical history of Dallas as told through its buildings. I think people really care about the history of their city. And if you can speak to them about the places that they're familiar with, it really brings them in to think about how the city works and to actually care about architecture. So I'm hoping this is an interesting new way of getting people to pay attention, a different kind of criticism that's engages both history and criticism and social history and the history of the city and sort of combines them into one big stew. So that's the way I am trying to get people to care about the city, and I may have gone over my time. My eyesight's not good enough to see the clock. Oh, look, I have 10 seconds. Oh, no, wait. Thank you very much, everybody. And I give you Alexandra, someone else.
Okay. I have my own colorful starter slide. There we go. Okay. So, the most important choice that you make as a critic is not how you write, but what to write about. You're never going to be the center of attention, but you have the power to direct attention. With that in mind, I think, there we go, sorry. The piece that I've written that I feel speaks the most to criticism now is this one, which is only available to read thanks to the Wayback Machine because corporate media hates archives. And in this piece, I called for the end of the architect profile. This piece was written in the wake of the semi-successful deplatforming of Richard Meyer, one of few architects to suffer consequences from the Me Too movement, likely because he was already writing on the coattails of his earlier work. So in this essay, I called for the end of what is likely the most popular product in architecture media, the profile that slots somebody new, usually a man, into the same old Frank Lloyd Wright genius inventor framework. This framing of the architect only became more explicit in an age when some of the largest projects underway are being built for tech companies. And profiles aren't criticism, except that they are often written by critics, and criticism, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, almost often framed the critique of a building around the personality of the architect. Paul Goldberger's review of Manhattan's Hearst Tower begins with the statement, "Norman Foster is the Mozart of modernism," which is a perfect tweet before Twitter even existed. And Herbert Muschamp, in his famous cover story on the Guggenheim Bilbao, takes the time to tell us that Frank Gehry is a very bad interview, but believes that that problem is Muschamp's and ours, not Gehry's. Fools give you reasons, wise men never try. And it was precisely this tendency in criticism that Michael Sorkin railed against in his piece, Why Paul Goldberger is So Bad, which is now on display at Columbia. And in this piece, he talks about the way that institutional media seemed determined to put a flattering frame on whatever the famous people wanted to produce. And when I wrote my own version, which you can see here in all of its deplatformed internet ugliness, I railed less against the Hollywood glamour profile and more about the tendency of criticism to follow rather than lead, chasing after newness and covering architecture as a series of grand openings, when in truth, everything important about architecture happens on either side of the opening. And while the question of framing is very important now, if you reach back in history, you can see some of our famous forefathers and foremothers of criticism struggling with the same thing. Louis Mumford in The New Yorker in 1939, writing about some striking shops designed by the then unknown Austrian emigre named Victor Gruen. And obviously, I think, as the author of a mall book, I think that architecture critics should spend more time thinking about shopping. What, after all, is the public architecture that we spend the most time in after schools? But Mumford was often dismissive of this work, preferring his own big books on big topics. He preferred to think of himself as the author of the book on the left, but I can tell you from experience that the book on the right, which is a collection of his New Yorker columns from the 1950s, has a lot more to say about the built environment that we live in now. Ada Louise Huxtable also had her struggles with the frame. This article, which was her first published in the New York Times, pays almost no attention to the architects of this Park Avenue school. Her power was really in labeling it a school at all. Perfect framing, which is aided, I think, by this genericizing photography, and describing the effects of these buildings on the ground. Talking about that experience on the ground became one of the hallmarks of Huxtable's subsequent career at the Times and then at the Wall Street Journal. But even she sometimes had to step away from the project of daily criticism to think bigger thoughts, as in her book, Unreal America. She was wearied by newsiness and the chasing rather than the pause to consider what was worth pursuing. Reframing, then, is a historical process, and it's as important for criticism as it is for architecture. My next book is going to cover the decade in the built environment from Earth Day 1970 to Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. And one of the architects/critics from the period who appears heroic to me in retrospect is Sam Vanderin, who co-wrote one of the first post-occupancy surveys of the recently completed Berkeley dorms. He was basically biting the hand that was feeding him at the time. And he had his students build this solar-powered pavilion that proved so offensive to the administration of the school that he and his subsequent classes were run off campus. He subsequently and briefly got to take his radical ideas to the literal seat of power and co-designed the first public solar office building as the state architect for Governor Jerry Brown. I had never heard of him or this building, the Bateson building, before I started to research one of the most maligned decades in American history, but it's more likely that my California colleagues have heard of him. And I think that his work now seems much more important than the much more highly publicized paper architecture of the period. So I see this third book that I've just completed as the third part in a trilogy of marginal topics. Kids, shopping, the 70s. They all are things that nobody seemed to me to be taking seriously enough. I consider it my privilege as a critic to not always focus on what is happening in architecture right now, and not to be an apologist for architects or to chase what's news, but to choose to write instead about the history that I think is going to be important in the future. In other words, the difficulties of criticism now are just the difficulties of criticism, and the writing is always better for it. Thank you.
I'm a Dickensian ghost. Thank you for bringing me to the 20th century. Thank you, Ollie, and our fellow critics for the great honor of your company. Thank you to the Loeb Fellowship, the GSD, to MIT, to the staff members and the administrators who have supported us today. We are worse at this than we used to be. At what we call the practice of architecture, the continuous destruction and construction, building by building, of the built environment. With rule-proving exceptions, we are not especially resourceful, we are not especially humane, we are not especially imaginative. The definitive difference between the work of today and the work of circa 1980 or 1970 is not style or technology or the consequences of our obligations to an ever more destroyed biosphere and atmosphere, but mere de-skilling. How have we come to be de-skilled from such essential collective duties as the making of the built environment in the service of human delight and planetary stewardship? That's the kind of question usually asked by some trad Tory classicist who says timeless virtues when he means old-fashioned vices. It's a strange new question for those who seek to believe in the unfinished project of the modern movement in design and culture as an imperfect answer to modernity in technology, society, and political economy. Criticality can be confused for cruelty, and cruelty can be disguised as criticality. Here at an architecture school, I feel obliged to acknowledge that part of the reason for this de-skilling is architecture's famous culture of cruelty. It's better than it was, it's worse than it must become. In pedagogy, we can stipulate that humiliation and exhaustion were never conditions for learning the collective creativity, creative courage, and radical calm at the heart of design practice. I'm reliably told that architecture school at Harvard is not as cruel as it once was, partially because of the centering of a cozy cat on your social media. I believe this, and I celebrate this. Keep it up. A primary reason for this de-skilling is that any practice is only as good as its critical practice. The defining condition of architectural criticism now is that it is not, if it ever was, institutionally supported. It is in this sense a folk art or an outsider art. One might compare this condition to the collapse of an ecosystem or of a legacy platform, but it seems to me that the brief and sparse history of architectural criticism, for all of its singular and sometimes heroic figures, Mumford and Huxtable and so forth, never constituted a sufficiently critical mass from which to implode. To speak personally, for me, any material support or capital exchanged relative to my own work as a critic of architecture has been, cumulatively over my body of work, trivial. As with the compensation of architects, it bears no relation to any value of the labor or any value of the work to its society. Every act of criticism that I undertake is therefore an act of charity. Piece by piece, this makes me a worse critic. When the first and third estate of a continental democratic republic collapse in thrall to the second, the fourth estate becomes ever more vital. The closer it gets to the practice of journalism, the better architectural criticism undertakes its most ethical missions and its most legible expressions to a general audience, most involuntarily and unwittingly affected and afflicted by the built environment. But the business of journalism is ever more subject to the long-standing predations of vulture capital and monopolization, to the well-known technological disruptions of media production and consumption, to the recent and peculiar abdication of cultural coverage and criticism by even newspapers of record, and right now to active assault by politicians and politically calculating billionaires, even the ones who own their own printing presses. A time traveler from the 1990s might say that this is to be celebrated as a collapse of establishmentarian homogeneity and corporate hegemony, and not to worry because the internet, because self-organizing and lateral distribution of decentralized and diversified information and opinion. To this innocent soul, we would explain that today our algorithmically streaming feeds are now just a simulation of the old internet, deceptively skinning the accelerated training of ourselves into vacant, pliant, and complicit tools for extractive use by learning machines and commodification by corporations. And that what we are thereby being de-skilled from is our innate capacity for boredom and for uncertainty, and therefore for critical thinking. Even as it suffers profoundly from the absence of institutional support, effective architectural criticism is, I think correctly, resistant to the institution. Critical institutionalization threatens institutional critique. We are outdoor cats. Nonetheless, here at the Academy, I would make the strongest possible case for the instant and innovative integration of architecture critics into architecture schools. And not only criticism's more scholastic and humanist practices in which it resembles history and theory, but its profane and worldly work as well. Design schools at startup speed can catch up to such precedents as the Parkesia Program for Public Discourse and the Point Symposia at the University of Chicago, or the Shapiro Center for Creative Writing and Criticism at Wesleyan. To repeat an observation made at the former by the author and literary critic Merve Emre, who is the director of the latter, it makes more sense to think about all of us as plural actors. That's the sociologist Bernard Lahir's term, than as faithless academics, with one foot in and one foot out of the academy. What would it look like for architecture critics to be plural actors? Plural action is derived from a speculative sociology of psychology proposed by Lahir in the 1990s. It emphasizes what a poet might call each individual's containment of multitudes and suggests for every individual a synchronous undertaking of practices that might otherwise seem contradictory and the polyvalent engagement of their individual inner plurality with the outer collective plurality called society. The answer to fascism's insistence that every we is an I is the assertion that every I is a we. Each of us do not have to get it together before we all get together. We have witnessed America over the last 10 years. We have witnessed the world over the last 2 years. We are made stupid by AI. We have burned through the one-time only 300-year civilizational energy boost of 300 million years of sunshine, conveniently stored in algae fossils. The climate crisis and the ongoing sixth great extinction of life on Earth remain by us, the responsible species, effectively denied. Now, to this gathering, I would need not explain why the design of the built environment, principally away from cycles of new destruction and new construction and towards adaptive reuse and material harvest, ensuring hyperurbanized dwelling in density, dignity, and delight, is the most acute tool for these times. Architecture remains the most direct way to make the world as it should be out of the world as it is. It's too bad that, as I said at the start, we are worse at this than we used to be. De-skilling is a form of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness emerges in one formulation when our ratio of awareness and information relative to agency and action gets too high. We now can know so much, and we feel we can do so little. This can induce a sense of moral injury, prompting a shame against which the human psyche defends itself with passivity and piety and false certainty. And especially the fatalism or nihilism that says we are too late and it is all over. We are entrained to be alienated from the radical accumulation of incremental change and from the power of our collective action. An architecture critic as a plural actor shifts this ratio by moving recklessly between our familiar role as agents of awareness to an emergent role as agents of action. Our critical actions may be analogous to the transgressive architectural practices of counter-programming and cross-programming, the wedding and the bomb shelter, that are so felicitously associated with adaptive reuse. It may be that precisely what seems the most useless about architectural criticism, between the two parts that matter most, will become what is most useful. We are always too late. Other genres of cultural criticism have historically been more capable of harm mitigation. A bad review can kill a bad play in New Haven before it even gets to Broadway. But people have no choice but to experience bad buildings, and to a bad building the critic arrives only at the very end of its making and points out that it could have been done in another way. Ours is a subjunctive practice as well as a subjective one. For me, the great lesson of the built environment relative to the natural environment is non-inevitability. Climate change presents as a force of nature, but it is merely a force of culture, of powerful people making choices, bad ones. Those who seek your complicity will tell you about inevitability, which presents as a liberation from all possibility of agency and all shame at its seeming absence. Those who seek your true liberty, such as we architecture critics, are those who will tell you about contingency, about futurity that is not destiny but uncertainty, who will tell you how it is precisely the exponential forces beyond our ken that give the small changes we can make to the small numbers under the exponents such compounding power, who will never come inside, but who may enable you to notice, one fine day, that you and a plurality of folk are here, outside, ready to begin.
Hello. I don't like podiums. I feel I'm already short, and I feel. Yeah, I'm Anjulie. I left my notebook in Chicago, so we're gonna wing it. I appreciate the fact that Mark started out with a beautiful image of Tui with a cigarette, because I want to start with kind of how I saw myself as a critic for a really long time. I remember very specifically a professor in grad school, Linda Keene, giving me a New Yorker a comic that it was like two men standing in like a construction site, and they're looking at the plans, and they're like, "Oh, A. Louise Huxley, oh, already hates it." And I was like, "Yeah, we can shut it down." I mean, the comic, what it should have done was actually just like showed the guys finishing the building anyway. But I found myself in this situation as a writer, and when I talk about writing, it's hard not to talk about the self. I feel like when you practice, as many of you who are students, right, when you develop a practice, you develop an intimacy, right, a certain type of closeness that you live in a place in your imagination that sort of no one else can go to. And the place in my imagination as an author earlier on was rage. I was living in Chicago. I was constantly frustrated by the city. I have so many photographs of this sign that went up around town whenever there'd be like a civic project happening that was like, Chicago, where you can expect things to work and people will be nice. And the joke is like nothing works, but people are okay. Mostly we're just patient with it. And I feel like as many people dealt with, the pandemic happened and we all started spending a lot more time within ourselves, right? We sort of located the world that we were missing inside of ourselves. I live on the west side of Chicago, and I started spending a lot of time with vacancy. For those of you who don't know, you can see the black dots on this map are a map of all of the vacant parcels in the city of Chicago. If you smoosh them all together, they would create basically twice the square footage of the entire business district downtown, or the Loop. We sort of understand, or we know, we like intrinsically feel the reality of this, especially if you live on the south or the west side. But I started having these really intense conversations with a friend of mine, Catherine Fennell, who is an anthropologist at Columbia. And we were thinking a lot about sort of when vacancy becomes an opportunity and when it becomes an opportunity for a great real estate investment. So much of this vacancy is just speculation. In the next couple of years, because of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, I think it was maybe something in the air or the water in the city, they were launching biennials between 2021 and 2023 that were designed to deal with this issue of vacancy. And what I sort of found was that architects acting as artists themselves, were readying this ground for the real estate roles to come in. I felt strongly this kind of aching distrust. The residents who were purportedly involved in these projects and these installations around the city, utilizing vacant lots, they were involved in so much as they could be a face to represent an entire community, right? Some of these neighborhoods have 90,000 people, and they get 5 people to come volunteer for a weekend, and they feel that that's involvement. I have 2:48, okay. I'm very good at watching the clock. After I sort of finished working with vacancy, which isn't really a finished project, it's a forever thing. If you know what vacancy feels like, it's eternal. But what I kind of was excited about was that people that don't live in the neighborhoods that I live in had a real fascination with failure. People love to talk about the failure of buildings, notably the kind of planned failure of public housing. In the city of Chicago, we have sort of a long and very ugly and very unfortunately still ongoing history with the demolition of our public housing projects. And so I started working with the National Public Housing Museum to try to understand what this obsession with failure is about. Failure actually kind of starts to move a little bit more, I guess, into the details of the actual material of the built environment. Failure brought me to the city of St. Louis, where I was able to look very specifically at the bricks of St. Louis. For those of you who don't know, St. Louis is a red city. Most of their buildings are a beautiful, deep red brick mined from the Cheltenham sink line underneath St. Louis itself. St. Louis was being robbed of its bricks. And through a kind of a long investigation alongside the artist Jackie Simmel, who's based in New Orleans, as well as R.J. Kolsilniak, who's at Eastern Michigan University and ran the St. Louis Brick Bank, we were able to kind of understand that the issue of failure, right, as buildings get taken apart, dismantled, stolen, sent downriver, sent to Phoenix to build the wealthy suburbs of the Sun Belt, that really what it was similar to public housing, a large-scale planned failure that was similarly as to public housing, blamed upon the city's most vulnerable and poorest residents. I feel like it's like hard to talk about, because I want to say the city isn't your friend, because it isn't. We are all kind of insiders in a way, you know, like we sort of participate and understand processes around design. However, I feel like so much of what is happening in the built environment, things like design competitions, those are my like scourge of my life, design competitions. They're trying to sell us something. And they're trying to like package this thing as a gift. And it makes me mad. I spent several years, I was a fellow with City Bureau, which is a news organization that brings fellows in to train kind of novice reporters in the basics of reporting. At the time of this fellowship, Lori Lightfoot, the mayor Lori Lightfoot was running Invest Southwest along with Maurice Cox. And I was curious about what was happening. They were planning these large-scale projects. There were like, there was a competition and pre-vetted vendors and minority businesses, and I didn't know what was going on. And then the pandemic happened, and I wanted to look into this a little bit deeper. And what was interesting, I learned a lot from this time looking at Invest Southwest. What I learned is actually that the city did not take me seriously. I FOIA'd for information, and they refused. We contacted people at the city who just either didn't respond to emails or wouldn't answer phone calls, hung up on us many times. And it was not a coincidence that Blair Kamen, our city's architecture critic, had recently stepped aside at that time, retired, took a buyout. It's almost like the city waits. They wait for you to walk away from a position where you're able to provide critique, to bring eyes to a project. And oftentimes these projects were happening without eyes outside of the neighbors. And what I found was essentially the city was going into particular neighborhoods and they were inserting some pretty interesting things. Here on the top right, you see a Carol Ross Barney multifamily development in Auburn Gresham. They hated it. The neighbors held community meetings that brought city officials in, and it was a rage fest. It was on Zoom. It was delightful. To the left, on a kind of a site of ongoing tragedy on the west side, which used to be a large-scale poisonous dump, the city decided that they were going to put a distribution facility. It was disappointing, to say the least, that in a community that is primarily occupied by Black residents, already dealing with issues of pollution, they would want to back up a whole bunch of diesel trucks. We also found that Amazon was a $90 million donor to the Invest Southwest Fund, but they didn't necessarily cut a check. They just built 2 distribution warehouses. And this is the way we start thinking about architecture and business development. I still don't think we've written enough about the policy failures and the design failures of the Amazon distribution facilities, but that's for another day. Finally, oh shoot, I'm sorry, I'm way over. I've been spending the last few years dealing with the high cost of building wealth. I think our most intimate built environment relationships occur in the home. And I have found that when I talk to people in the public, when I kind of deal with issues of affordability, no one actually knows what they're talking about. They talk about the fact that we need more affordable housing, but they don't actually know what affordability means. When I work with students who are designing affordable housing as an assignment, they don't know what LIHTC is. They don't know how the syndicators operate. A big part of my work at Dwell isn't just dealing with kind of ideas around housing, it's dealing with the fact that we have an entire generation of people, starting at sort of young Gen X, elder millennials, who have been completely disillusioned by by home, the idea of home in general. I don't know, I guess I did the assignment kind of weird, Ollie, but this isn't really like a provocation, but this is sort of what I've learned. I've sat in hundreds of community meetings. I've talked to thousands of residents, architects, business leaders. I truly believe that design does not solve the fundamental problems of political will, mayoral transitions. Trauma fostered distrust, right? Whether it's the biennial waltzing into the West Side neighborhoods, or someone saying, hey, I'm going to give you a gift of affordable housing, but you will have no say in its timeline. You will have no ability to have any sort of like community liaison. And finally, design does not deal with the problems of financial extraction, or even generally the financialization that so many residents themselves deal with. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. Sorry I went over.
See if I can get that right. Hi. I am so happy to be here with this incredibly talented, wonderful group of critics and colleagues. Thanks, Ollie, the Loeb, GSD, MIT, everyone who was bringing us together. It doesn't happen as often as it should, although I was here in 2013 with Alexandra on another panel like this. So it does happen sort of cyclically to talk about criticism. So I've got five points to make, 5 points hopefully in 6 minutes and 12 seconds, but who's counting? I want to start here with criticism needs platforms. You know, we've talked about some of the content of criticism. We've talked about what its role is, who the critic is. I want to say that the platforms that host criticism really matter, whether it's a magazine, a newspaper, a Substack. This is the place where we write, and that place shapes how and what we write, and especially who we write for. You know, when there's that old chestnut, which comes up in the same cycles as we do panels, the crisis of criticism, it gets thrown around. It's usually when there's a transition, technological or economic, impacting the structures that support criticism. It's not about the critic per se. There's always plenty of critics. So I founded a platform. The architecture zine Loud paper back in 1997. I was a grad student for architecture at Zeiger, and it was my thesis. Before I published even a single issue, I mailed out a poster that had this call for submissions. Loud paper is open to all. Students, architects, educators, Girls About Town, Dear Johns, and critics as a place for writing loud about architecture and culture. And mind you, this is a time before the social web, and it was a self-published zine, which seemed to me to be the most accessible and democratic way to foster an emerging set of voices around architecture, especially as a way it met pop culture. By the way, don't send anything to that email, it's long dead. Criticism is communal. Criticism brings people together, like we're doing right now. Like publishing is at its most exciting when it draws folks together in conversation. Either it's online debate, in-person debates, we don't get those very much either, or in roundtable. So, a couple years ago, I was invited by Stairwell Gallery in Los Angeles to exhibit Loud paper, right? Something very vintage. And I took that opportunity as a chance to digitize and archive 13 issues produced between 1997 and 2008. But rather than simply dwell in the retrospective, I used the opportunity to convene a series of discussions on design publishing, past, present, future. And this was in 2024, and we were all feeling the long effects of post-COVID atomization. Gathering around an apartment table felt intimate and generative. No one person had an answer to the difficulties facing independent publishing, but at least we were all facing it together. And a few months later, I was asked by the Mac Center to show another series of publications on a table by designer Ryan Preciado. And there was a chance to open up the archive to new generations of readers who could just hang out and read and talk around the table. So that act of criticism right there. Criticism is collective. This is similar but different. In 2013, I published a piece in Volume magazine entitled Towards a Collective Criticism. And it came out of my experiences on Twitter, which was then pre-Toxic X, and where a lot of folks in this room were engaged in architecture critic. We were debating architecture and design. And some were critics, some were not, but we all were kind of embedded in each other's writings and sort of responses in a really kind of generative way. And I appreciated the horizontality of that space, which was part of Twitter at the time. And our present moment has, of course, seen the dark side of these platforms, which tend to algorithmically silo, fragmenting something that in retrospect felt more holistic. There's certainly pockets of collective discourse, say on Substack, with folks like Lila Allen at Wrong House or David Michonne at Forescale, but the platform tends to reward on an individual basis. Better examples might be found outside of architecture, such as 404 Media, a digital media company founded by 4 journalists, or my favorite, LA Taco, which started out as a food blog, but actually has been absolutely essential reading for updates on the ICE occupation in Los Angeles and all the protest activities. Less is not more. I call for collective criticism not to erase authorship, but because the complexities of our current moment require a more robust model in order to be sustainable. I think as Thomas pointed out, we are kind of in this moment of where criticism becomes almost, a hobby, a kind of act of love, and we need to figure out ways to make that more sustainable. We need a larger collective voice. Critics need other critics. I often return to this quote. It's a letter from architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable, which she wrote to her New York Times editor, Abe Rosenthal, in 1969, a year we know of free love at Woodstock, of the Stonewall riots, of anti-war protests. And in New York City, swaths of lower Manhattan were demolished to make way for Yamasaki's World Trade Center, which was then under construction. Huxtable argued that the paper needed more architecture and urban design coverage to keep pace with the same rapid transformations, transformations that were underway. The same is true today. We need more of these voices to deal with what Ollie had mentioned, the kind of developer mindset that is going on in our communities. So I included Huxtable's quote in this provocation, Abolish the Architecture Critic, which I penned for Dezeen in 2021. And again, this point is less is not more. After deeply thinking about the role of the critic in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and about the gatekeeping and structural inequity that I had observed and experienced in journalism, as Anjulie mentioned, architecture critic Blair Kamen had stepped down from the Chicago Tribune, and there seemed to be a bunch of folks competitively jockeying for the slot. And it struck me that it wasn't really about who got that post, but that we needed more critics, indeed a more diverse set of perspectives, rather than a sacred few newspaper critics, present company, I'm sorry, in order to really address our current moment. Sorkin seems to be floating in the room too. It's the city, stupid. I cribbed this line from the late Michael Sorkin and his essay, Advice to Critics, which was written in 2004, right around the time of the Gulf War. Things cycling back. He reminds writers that it's their duty to situate their work within the social, cultural, infrastructural, and political systems of the urban context rather than focusing myopically on the building. He writes, just as our own personalities are formed in interaction, so architecture is forged in the crucible of collectivity. I have been really fortunate to be part of the effort to launch the Los Angeles Review of Architecture, or LARA. It's a sister publication to the New York Review of Architecture and the upcoming Chicago Review of Architecture. And I worked with Nicholas Kemper and Sammy Medina and their incredible team, first as a guest editor and then as an editorial advisor with Shane Renner-Roth. If we look at this stellar lineup, dang, you'll see there's a lot of critics, established and emerging, most of them local and reporting on the city as it unfolds around them. Everyone is writing their heart out with urgency in order to try to capture what's going on in LA just months after the wildfires destroyed whole neighborhoods and in the midst of National Guard occupation and ICE raids. Articles covered construction after the fires, housing development, and Waymo shenanigans, among other topics. And I'll end with this slide. This is the LARA launch party for issue number 2, which was held last October. Our first launch party a couple years earlier attracted 400 people. This one attracted more than 500. Writers like Alyssa Walker and Joanne McNeil read their pieces from this makeshift pulpit, and the whole event felt like an act of solidarity in a time of crisis. It embodies my previous points for what make up criticism now. It's a platform that is communal, collective, and grounded in the urgency of place. Thank you.
Great. Well, wow. Thank you all so much for those provocations and for trying to stick to 7 minutes as closely as you could. I'm going to kick off by playing devil's advocate, given that we're in an architecture school of design. I would say for the last 20 years, the architecture critic has tended to shift to become more of a kind of urban critic, as I think was reflected in a lot of your presentations. And we focus a lot on the kind of invisible forces, the kind of economic, the flows of finance, the planning policies, the mortgage industry, the environmental collapse, all of the things kind of around architecture. Is there a danger by doing that we're actually giving architecture itself a kind of free pass?
I mean, I jump on that like a cat, simply because it helps me waffle further about this idea of inevitability and choice, because cities, obviously, as we know, in a miraculous way, can behave like natural systems, complex systems. I learned this from an amazing book called Local Code by Nicholas de Monchaux. And the behavior of cities at scale, because the cities are made by organisms, therefore that behavior is organic. And anyone who's looked out of an airplane at night at the beautiful, mysterious neural networks of illuminated Chicago can see that. It is self-evident. And yet, perhaps the problematic of the city is that it enables this myth of inevitability, this idea of something that is a force of nature because of its scale and complexity and the learned helplessness of its illegibility, and that therefore one needs to push back against that. My father, John de Monchaux, used to say that a good city or a bad city thinks it's a very big building, and a good building thinks it's a very little city. And I just kind of love that argument for complexity at a certain scale and for a much more complicated relationship between what we think is inevitable, what we think we're powerless against, what we think is nature, which we can mistake for the city, and what we think is a realm of choice, which we can also mistake for architecture, but perhaps architecture gives us an instrument to engage the question.
Who else wants to jump in?
I think that architects are more irritated by not being talked about than they are by being talked about.
Do any architects in the audience want to respond to that?
No. I mean, if there's someone who wants to write about the object, write about the object. No one's stopping you. However, I would be way more stoked on the object, the criticism of the object, if that criticism was durational and began with permitting. Because I feel like a frustration that I often had is that people would see a review saying, this is this new building, and they're like, when did this happen? Or what is that hole in the ground? I think that these things happen years often before, and there's like a whole series of processes, opportunities to, converse about what's being planned before it happens. And I feel like like locking it into the finished product is where I guess it kind of like, it'll spark some immediate conversation, right? It's a good building, it's a bad building, whatever. People have opinions about that, but as like a durational exercise, I think that there's a lot more opportunity for people to actually learn something from criticism and engage in like much deeper like conversations.
I try and do both. I love to do both. I think there's an obligation on the parts of architecture schools to sort of teach criticism, because there are two schools or paths of architecture criticism. There is the journalist path, and then there is the professional path. So Michael Sorkin was an architect, Ada Louise Huxtable was a journalist. And these are sort of, I think often it's the architecture paths who are more able to speak to the profession and the formal, to provide a formal criticism of design. I'd like to think, I can do both. I think I know I speak for Alexandra and I don't speak for us. I say we both come from more of like a historian's perspective, right? Studying our graduate degrees are in architectural history, so a sort of like a middle ground between those two ways of thinking.
Out of interest, which of you trained as architects, or like studied architecture? Okay, so half, a bit more than half.
Our panel perfectly illustrates my point. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll just keep quoting Sorkin all night. From the same piece that I quoted from, one of his points is credit affects, not intentions. And I think that that dovetails with like what you're asking around like what is the effect of a building. I think in your work, like I think you're really good at sort of using the building as a kind of point in order to show a kind of ripple within an urban context. And I think I too, sort of like to play that, and Mark does this. I think we're engaged in the building as a critical object. I think we've all done a walkthrough of a building and can do that in our sleep, sort of regurgitate, sort of like, and then you go to this space and this space. But I think the skill is, how do we make that mean something larger and maybe different than what the kind of the stakeholder, architect, client, developer is trying to tell us, right? Like, I think that's when we make that ripple through a well-cast stone.
I wanted to move on to another criticism that we often get as critics, which is, well, could you do any better? There's often this thing of that we're just a bunch of whining old complaining so-and-sos. And I suppose the point of this question is, should we actually be being propositional? Like, is it the role of the critic to just be reactive, or is it a kind of proactive, active discipline? Now, I was interested in Mark's example of Dealey Plaza, where that was an alternative proposal. Like, is that something we should be engaging in as critics?
I mean, I think a lot of criticism has, for a long time engaged at some level in that, wrapping up at the end and saying, okay, I was disappointed in this thing, but, generally speaking, this is what I would have liked to see. I think for a critic to, kind of replace one object directly with another object through words, that's not a very open path, and that's not a great idea. But I do think that critics should take on themselves the idea that they could point out, how they would have written the program differently, or the specifics of how it does or does not, engage the constituencies or the street. Yes,
we can do better. And in that we, it's an expanded we. It's not just we the critics, it's we the architects, it's we the entire community that's invested in the built environment and the natural environment. We all can do better. And I would complicate and expand that we, again, with this idea of the plural actor. The critic is the plural actor, criticism is plural action, where theory and practice, commentary and creativity are recklessly and relentlessly and creatively confused, and that it is not that one artificial moment of the opening, and where in Empyrean discernment and perfectly objective subjectivity, some pronouncement is made, and I think in this way we can act much more organically and collaboratively and cooperatively.
Let me take a different angle on this. I mean, there's this, I think you're speaking to this general public perception that, those who can't do teach, and then those who can't teach gym, or become critics. And I love architects and the city. I love architecture, not necessarily architects. But I did not want to become an architect. I never wanted that. I am a writer. I want my work judged, as writing, as a literary and critical endeavor, as well as its sort of, what its impact is. So that's why I write. And that's how I think the criticism should be judged. So I think this sort of you hear all this, the critic of the critic is like, well, you just couldn't do it yourself. It's like, but I think that's not where we're coming from.
Your whole piece on the reimagining the plaza was a really interesting example of a critic being proactive and offering an alternative. Could you explain a bit about how that happened? And was it a difficult sell to your editor?
It was an easy sell to the editor because thankfully Stoss, Chris Reed, and Monica Ponce de Leon, who did such a wonderful job in it, did it pro bono. So we didn't have to pay for it, which of course is always the problem at a newspaper. So, it stemmed, from an article that I'd written about the problems with Dealey Plaza, about how dangerous it was and how it was also failing its job as a memorial space. And, Chris and I were talking about that article, and it's sort of together we decided, like, what if we developed a sort of alternative to show people what could happen there. And I think that's part of the architect's job, is to sort of how do you engage the public, how do you rethink spaces that are problematic. So it was great. I wasn't the one shaping the design. I was there to help point them and be the client essentially, rather than the practitioner.
So a few years ago, I did some soul searching. Like Anjulie was talking about criticism in the self. I was doing some searching around what is my role as a critic, and thinking about the difference between being an activist and an advocate. And I came to the kind of role of advocate. My job is to platform ideas, to sometimes platform people, right, whose work I see as important and underrepresented. And sometimes it's activist, but really that really only works kind of in questions of preservation projects. I think even there, the history of architecture critics being involved in questions of preservation is one of much more of advocacy rather than frontline activism. I think there are many things I can do as a critic that are a productive advocacy rather than sort of say fighting against things. I've been writing about LACMA and for many, many years now, right? And that, almost $800 billion or $1 million later, it has risen. So clearly that activism has not me and Pulitzer Prize folks.
Do you feel any of your words had an effect on the final scheme?
I will tour it in a few weeks, and I will give my definitive. But but I think that is also one where the city, the relationship to the city, is what perhaps matters more than sort of an individual experience of the art museum.
Anything to add? Okay.
I don't know if we were taking turns. I do it better. I have a master's in journalism. I can't do it better. But one thing that I can do is I guess I should say I haven't really been a capital C critic in a long time. I feel like I've operated more as a journalist and a reporter, which allows me to be critical in a different way. So much of the kind of profile problems, right? For me, I also think is a profile problem where the architecture critic is a solo person. My favorite thing to do is talk to experts. And I love architects because you guys always take my calls. They're so happy to. And it's not even just I'm asking you about your work, I'm asking you as an expert, right? And that's kind of dignifying in a way, right? That I'm not just there being tell me about your project. I'm saying I need to know what you think about this strategy. Is this developer is telling me that this sustainability system is going to do X, Y, and Z. Do you actually think that's true? And that is in a way architects aren't just subjects, they're sources. So for me, it's not necessarily about solving problems. I don't feel like my job is to make a suggestion about how they could do it better. My job is to talk to experts and talk to people who, when I say expertise, I mean even uncredentialized people who live near the site, people who walk past it every day. I am no stranger to the man on the street interviews. I will talk to anyone, but it's to include that type of expertise it's a relief in a lot of ways from the pressure to feel like I need to know more than the person producing the thing that I am criticizing. Yeah?
Maybe as a footnote to that, I love that you say that, because I think most of what architects do is talk to experts. Like it's a strange common ground of this radically synthetic intelligence and horizontal adjacency that architectural practice at its best shares with journalistic and related critical practices, and that the kind of blurring of that synthesis and that the exchange of that synthesis can also perhaps reflect the plurality of action that we see in something like what you proposed around the Dealey Plaza project, or this kind of exchange of roles, and we can also be the experts that we're talking to.
Interview each other. Before opening it up to the audience, I wanted to introduce the dark side briefly, which is the PR industry, rarely spoken about, especially by us, because we rely on them. So you might not know, but when a major building opens anywhere in the world, the client hires a very expensive communications consultant to choose which journalists get invited to the opening, who's allowed access.
Anything happens in the world.
Yeah, not just buildings, anything at all. It's true. War, even. Crisis consultants. But for the purposes of this evening, let's, buildings, public spaces, urban development. So it's an incredibly choreographed process, which is never really spoken about. How do you guys deal with that? Are you ever worried about being too critical of an architect or of an industry that you won't get invited back? You won't get the special preview access? Do you say yes to press trips? Do you turn them down? How do you deal with that dodgy dark side?
Well, I'll just say there's Alia and at least me, or I think most of us who write in the United States have a very different relationship to PR, because most European newspapers will allow their critics to accept travel expenses for such press visits, while American newspapers will not. So if I'm going to go visit something, I have to go, I have to get my newspaper to pay to do that. And they are, as you can imagine, less and less, inclined to do that. So it's a little bit of a different relationship, and it's actually when I've talked about a lot with my editors. I'm trying to convince them to adopt a little bit more of a European style attitude. Yes,
bribery, you mean?
Yes, it's incredibly self-interested and comes with its own, challenges, which is, I think, what Ali's getting at. But at some point, the question is either we cover it with some help and acknowledge that there is a conflict of interest here, or at least admit to it, so the reader knows, or we don't cover it at all. And my argument is, there are times where it's not covering it at all is a bigger problem than the conflict.
I mean, you started this by asking, are we not reviewing enough buildings? And I think, at least for myself, a few years ago, I did stop reviewing buildings out of a combination of exhaustion and feeling like that was not something that the readers that I was writing for really wanted to read about anyway. So now most of what I write about is not buildings, and it is largely outside the PR cycle because, let's say one of the pieces in my Pulitzer Prize winning package was about this mega swing in Philadelphia at a playground, and they did not have a whole PR apparatus, even though it is the largest swing in America. I thought that was pretty damn cool. Yeah, so I was like, let me email the Parks Department in Philadelphia and see if they will meet me at the swing. Let me see if Bloomberg will pay, the relatively low cost for me to take the train to Philadelphia for the day and hang out by the swing. Let me interview the teenagers hanging out by the swing. And I think that is an important work of design and architecture. So I think, again, like as I was saying before, if you frame your job, depending on how you frame your job, you can actually step outside that PR apparatus.
I mean, I would be very grateful for that word duration, Anjulie, that you gave us. It's going to be my takeaway, one of my takeaways for the evening. And I'm very grateful also for this brilliant observation, Alexandra, that the least important moment is that moment of opening. And that's the moment when those PR professionals swarm around and do their evil. And the great saving grace of architecture, perhaps, is its slowness. It takes so much time to make it, and then it takes so much time to live in it, and to dwell in it, and to really design it as a user, to make of it what we will, to discover what it is. And I think playgrounds especially are made by their users in action and imagination. And if only all the city were a playground, as it should be, and perhaps as it is, that would be ever more self-evident. And so the slowness, I think, is one of our defenses of good against evil. And one of the things I'm very grateful to for some of my lovely editors at N+1 and at the New York Review of Architecture, especially Sammy Medina and the work he's doing to convene community, is he'll invite me to review something years after the fact, like far too late, which is, of course, just like right on time. And by then, the PR folk have moved on to much more profitable projects. And so the kind of the anachronism, the asynchronicity, the strange dissonance of the refresh rate, of the slowness of architecture and the fastness of your feed, I think somewhere in the tension between the slow and the fast is where so much good work can be done.
Wow. I got into a big Twitter debate with Blair Kamen about this around a Chicago architecture biennial press junket a few years ago. With, Blair suggesting that anyone who's on the junket basically cannot have the clear-eyed, non-influenced judgment of a critic. And I did not review the biennial favorably. I did not feel like I had to pull my punches, and I don't think the expectation, at least I don't hold that expectation, that I need to do that. I think PR people are not the enemy. However, I think they are doing their jobs. It's not an easy job. They have to deal with people like us, and they have to deal with people on the other side, on the architecture side. So I think they kind of...
And in my experience, they're often big fans of architecture.
I think one thing that maybe unites critics, PR people, and architects is we're all big geeks. You don't get in this niche area without it. So, we are architects. We are interested in the built environment, and we care about it deeply. So I will call it as I see it every time, and if that means that. In the case of some large Los Angeles museums, I don't get a privileged access to it, as some critics not on this panel have. Because I didn't write favorably about it, then I'll wait my turn and do it then.
Here's just slow criticism. That can be another point number 6 to add to the manifesto. Right, time to open it up.
I have to talk about PR people.
Sorry.
Thank you.
How could I forget?
Do you want to know why? Do you know how many jobs I've had?
Have you been banned?
I have a whole collection of name tags and hairnets. I have washed the floors of a David Adjaye museum. I had a job once where I was tasked with skinning dead horses to feed to wolves. My most insane job was in PR. I worked in PR. I have been in a sedan with another PR rep. She was driving. I was in the front seat with 4 angry women in the back, shuttling them between opening events. They were in like full, gowns and makeup, and they were mad. The thing that unites architects, PR people, and critics is that we have all been screamed at.
But sometimes by architects.
Yes, mostly.
Or punched.
By other architects. I actually really love PR people. And when we talk about slowness, when I am able to build really positive relationships with PR people, they know how I work. And they give me the space, and they are able to say, like, listen, this guy's giving the tour or whatever, and he's the kind of like primary guy for quotes, but I think you should talk to this person because this person actually like dealt with, the engineer that we think you might be interested in. And that's a gift in a lot of ways. And I feel like PR sort of gets this bad reputation from, I don't know if you watched that HBO show Hacks. These like agent reps, like they're very intense. But I think in that intensity, it comes from just like being used to facilitating stardom for other people. And not actually ever getting a chance to kind of like be in the conversation. So build relationships with PR people because I was one. We're lovely people. Also, they can do real good things for you and give you the time that you need, right? They're not going to push you. They're going to give you the sources that you need. They're going to connect you to other people.
They can also block you. I just wanted to.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but that's like a whole thing, right? That we kind of run the risk all the time of being like blacklisted, but like we just like let it go. It's okay. Like it's okay if you don't get the executive access or whatnot. People are still going to read your column, Ollie.
Right. Who has a question? Okay, first hand here, and then was there one over there? Second question. Yeah, we'll start here.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to the group. I'm Charles Birnbaum from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, Loeb Fellow, 97, 98. So you kids were just, some of you were in diapers then. But all kidding aside, a number of people here have been my go-to. Mimi, to use your words, as a person that's an advocate, activist, we rely on people that do what you do to help amplify our message. And, Blair Kamin's been mentioned tonight, and I just want to say out loud, John King and Christopher Hume and Bob Campbell and so many others who cast long shadows in the city in which they operated very much, Mark, in the way that you do in Dallas, and thank you. My specific question we talk often about the demise of the critic at large at a paper. But what I don't think we're talking about a lot is what it means to work in a post-shame world. And as someone who has evidenced this, just to give one example, the New York Times did 5 stories about Mary Mrs. Greenwood Pond double site, and the museum board at the Des Moines Arts Center didn't budge, and it was destroyed, and there was an out-of-court settlement. So my question for all of you as people with the pen, how do you operate in a post-shame world, and what might be your secret sauce?
Shame is different from humiliation. And we are amongst the shameless, for sure, the powerful shameless. But interestingly, I think even the most powerful people, perhaps seemingly the most powerful person who shall not be named, is primarily guided by humiliation and its avoidance or its perception. And I think rhetoric and conversation and discourse in the best possible way, in the service of good. I think there's a sort of strange positive humiliation that the humble can inflict upon the that remains available to us for now. So I'm sort of quietly and radically optimistic about the possibilities that presents. But it is obviously hard. And I think this beautiful, complicated role of activism and advocacy is part, again, of this kind of long duration of the plural action of the critic. And I really welcome the question, even as I fail to answer it.
May I? Just to answer that directly, I think the only answer to that is just to be honest and tell the truth. And I have a good example of this. It's actually a landscape story, Charles. A couple of years ago, I wrote a review of a new park being designed at enormous expense in Dallas and being funded by the gentleman who funded the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth smear campaign, and also owned major polluting companies. And this new park in Dallas is being named for this man. And I wrote quite explicitly that was wrong, that the park shouldn't be named. The family of the deceased man, for whom it's good, took out the next Sunday, took out 4 full-page ads in the newspaper defending the choice of the name. So sometimes you just got to call it the way you see it. And, it made our editors really uncomfortable. But, that's the way it goes. If you want criticism, you got to live with criticism.
Oh, I was just going to say that, yes, there is a history of shame leading to better urban outcomes, but I often think that, the thing that stops a horrible project is some subsection of a subsection of the law that was actually intended for other purposes. So I think that criticism is part of it, but lawyers are also part of the process, and I think a lot of them are still on the job.
I wanted to mention lawyers as well. I would say they get in the way of shame. I wrote a very long piece about the Me Too movement in architecture years ago, and the Guardian's legal team thought it was too sensitive and had it spiked. And that's the reason these stories haven't been exposed. It's through legal threats. We all know there are so many more people than the ones that have been named and shamed, waiting to be exposed. But newspaper lawyers are very risk averse, so they may not see the light of day.
Duration is on our side.
Durational piece.
It's a challenging question to answer because, shame is also fear. And I think we're working within an administration that wants us to be afraid. And while I don't think what I do necessarily is quote unquote woke, my grok profile thinks otherwise. And says so explicitly. So in the data set that will be drawn upon around this moment, that is actually, something that's very fearful. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't want to speak, truth to power, but it does give me pause, and the way that other the platforms for criticism are shrinking, and in the larger way, is also something that I find concerning. Now, I do, like I kind of mentioned in my thing, I do find that in solidarity, smaller publications that are finding each other, the way that, say, LA Taco is working with groups in Minneapolis to train sort of on-the-ground journalism. This, you would think that this is maybe beyond the scope of architecture criticism, but I think it is kind of adjacent models. I think can help us build kind of better responses. And again, a shout out to the New York Review of Architecture and all of its affiliates, because on a very tiny resources, they have been having a large group of people sort of pen maybe shame-free, very brave responses.
Any more questions? Yes, one up in the middle. If we got a roving mic. Keep your hand up, and then, yeah. And then one here, is that right? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was great. This is just a very brief follow-up to that last question, but I'm curious if you all think that shame is a productive paradigm in criticism. Like how, is shame so important that we need to re-examine criticism if shame is over? And, if not, what are the other kinds of conceptual paradigms that can motivate change through criticism?
Can you say what you mean by shame as a conceptual paradigm? That sounds extremely wise and clever, and I would like to understand it.
I'm not sure about all that, but I guess from my very limited knowledge of this topic, as someone sort of trained in architecture and not even fully, if that, one of the ways that architectural criticism produces change in the built environment is through illuminating things that we might not want about our buildings to the general public, which I sort of is what I understood to be the subtext of this question of like, if powerful people are sort of immune to being called out publicly, then, what does criticism do? So I just wonder, like, if we sort of accept that, like, we can do our best and call things as we see it, and we still might not be able to affect change, like, what can we try next? Or what might we want to try next as a way of bringing about change in the built environment?
Well, I mean, I don't think shame has never been the only thing, and I think the most obvious one is love. I think that panel that we were on here previously was about love and architecture. Was that the theme? I'm pretty sure that was the theme.
I think I remember you talking about
yes,
love.
And I have a piece called Criticism Equals Love. And I actually believe that. And just to explain briefly, like what I mean by that, it means like the other way you motivate people to save things, make better cities is by explaining to them, like bringing them along with you in the emotion of love for the place and your own belief in the power of design to actually make things better.
I think that's part of what I was getting at when I was talking about how a culture of critique can all too easily be confused with a culture of cruelty, and they are in fact quite different from one another. And criticism at its best is a ministry, and it's a ministry of love, and that's a beautifully 1970s word to throw around here in the 2020s, but I really mean it. Peace and love, and I think that those actually do offer us radical and non-trivial alternatives to the relatively constrained modality of shame. I think loving shamelessness perhaps is the wave of the future.
Can I get a criticism is the Ministry of Love T-shirt? Are you selling those? Is that eBay available?
It's right here. This is what that T-shirt looks like. This is a ministry of love. This advocacy.
Anjulie.
I mean, I was going to add that I think the questions about shame are interesting because like I'm in it for the love, man. Like I always feel, well, if you ever want to help a high schooler decide to go into design of some type, you put them in the car and you drive them around and you say, what would you want to change, right? Starting from a place where they feel like they have agency rather than a feeling of shame, especially when you live in a place where you might imagine there's a lot to be ashamed about. I think that like the other kind of part of that coin is pride. Like, what are we proud of? What could we be proud of? Whether it's like you as a critic talking about a building, how that building fits into a broader context, or you're talking about what it means to sort of be in a city, to be a citizen of a city. That like that pride there, I think that's what people sort of, in some ways, I feel like that's what we've lost. Like in readership, people are looking for rage bait, and they're not really looking for something that makes them feel like proud to be a part of something. I haven't figured out how to get to that yet. I think that that's a place I go to again in my imagination, but that's what I'm working toward, at least.
Call for pride bait. That's what we need more of.
Pride bait.
I just want to maybe add that, like, yes to love and pride. I think what may sort of lead to this idea that architecture criticism equates shaming is the prevalence of the hot take, which is really good clickbait, and sometimes even pieces that are not hot takes get hot take headlines in order to provoke more clicks and algorithmic, wonderfulness. So I think, again, the platforms and how this material circulates is really kind of important because it's privileging a lot of work which really does the takedown rather than, say, the build-up.
Hi, my name is Jacek. Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. I'm one of the Loebs, and Ollie was right. We like taking place, and and you can't stop us from talking. So I have 6 questions.
Watch out.
Yeah, I will try to limit myself to 5 or maybe less. But to kind of draw on what you already said, if we accept that there is a crisis of platforms, there's a crisis of places where you can perform your criticism through either written or spoken word, what are the alternatives? How can you conceive of criticisms by other means? Like where can you take your skills, your critical skills, outside of the spoken or written word? Maybe that refers to the idea of the future of criticism to some extent. And I'm also wondering if this the shortage of platforms is indicative of a larger problem, which is the crisis of readership or crisis of attention span and so on. So in short, what could other means of performing architecture critique be in the times of the collapse of readership? And which question should I choose?
I think you did it. I think you chose it.
I have one. I have one more very short, which is, what is the point of satisfaction for critics? Where are you satisfied as a critic?
When there are no architects left.
So 2 questions. I have 4 more, but I will limit.
I think at the risk of being very 1976 with you and kind of loving on America, we're in this ridiculous experiment of a country that was written into being by documents, by flawed people who lined up a bunch of words and in their scripture, in the beginning was the Word. And I think for all the stimulus of screens and visual intelligence and other mechanisms that surround us, language is such a radically common ground. And I do, in fact, think that we can speak it into being and listen it into being and write it into being and read it into being. And I think that the beautiful thing about writing, look at those Emily Dickinson poems on scraps of paper, on the wrong sides of envelopes, in stolen moments. And an entire universe can be made of that. And, that's probably why I've squandered my Master's of Architecture degree on writing, because it's a fast and slow art in response to a slow and fast world. So keep the faith.
You just tried anything here that's not just writing?
Have you ever watched people scuttle across the crosswalk? That, I think, is actually one of the most profound criticisms, because it's not a real run. It's like a fake, there's something really exciting about that motion, and watching each person do it differently. They're communicating something that they're afraid of, something that they're frustrated with. If I ever did a PhD, my dissertation would be on the. But I think that this idea of like performance actually gives us a real opportunity to think about, right? Because it's actually just the body, right? We can use the body. The body is medium. I teach in an art school, so like I've seen this happen from 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds who really feel that their body being in space. There's something about young people like really excited about their body in space, but they understand that this is a political act, right? They are sort of dealing with being young and being queer, or being young and being large, or like whatever it is that they're sort of grappling with. They realize it can be an opportunity to like critique the way that the world is not meant for them, or the way that the world has rejected their own sort of like body or their sense of being. I think performance would be a really exciting thing, but I don't know. I'm into it. I'll try it.
Has anyone in the audience tried that? Criticism through interpretive dance? Yeah? Okay. How?
Students who stage like a race through the crossing, just to indicate how short time performing.
You can measure your life in that.
I mean, the task of criticism is arguably simply to enrich the relationship between action and speech action, and ultimately to confuse the two, and the being and the doing and the saying eventually all combine and collaborate, and action is speech action, and that's part of what it means to be in plural action.
But just on a more practical level, I mean, we are all quite old school writers. I mean, is anyone here seeing the future of criticism on TikTok or Instagram
It's
Reels?
terrifying.
He says, sounding like a grandpa.
It's terrifying. I turn my Instagram Reels on, and it's always some goofball standing in front of a building giving very basic. But, I mean, we need to sort of figure out how to adapt to that. And the fact that I'm a giant dinosaur who hasn't done so yet is maybe my fault rather than the that's where we're going, and sort of I think there's an onus on us to follow that. I actually taught a class here a year and a half ago, and so some of the students are, I think, actually here, on architecture and film. And architecture, I'd change it to architecture and screens, because I think, this is the way we communicate now, is through screens, through video, and part of the project of that class was to sort of, try and have students create new ways of thinking critically that aren't just on essays or writing.
I was just going to say, I mean, I have been a professional journalist since 1994, so I actually feel like while most of the things that I have done are with words, I have already tried so many things. Like, I write essays, I produce a podcast, I am relatively funny on Twitter, now defunct. I think I'm also relatively funny on Instagram, possibly soon to be defunct, to be replaced by Reels. I'm trying to remember. There are other things, there are talk, I guess I feel like all of us have already tried a lot of things, done a lot of things, lived through 17 pivot to video cycles. So there's a certain amount of weariness with this whole thing, and the belief maybe somewhere deep in my heart that ultimately the 5-paragraph essay is the thing that endures.
The cockroach of journalism.
Can I make a silly speech about this? Because I think I've all these people should we all be on YouTube or should we all be on TikTok, man? And I'm I think about I teach 18 and 19-year-olds, and they every day wake up and they are bombarded by art on Instagram, right? They're making their own art and they're seeing this has 40,000 likes, this has however many likes, and yet somehow these precious people go back into their studios and continue to make their puppets or their paintings or whatever it is that they're working on. And I dream of that type of strength. When I feel maybe self-conscious or shame that I see someone on TikTok talking about the skinny skyscraper and getting all of this attention. And, you know, I got 4 likes on a thing on Twitter or whatever. I have to remind myself that, like, I can't shrink because I have 18-year-olds who have more fortitude than that. Like, when you find something that you want to do and you can do it, it's incredible. It's just like an incredible feeling. So be like the 18-year-olds. Find your thing. Yeah.
Any students want to pose a question? Yeah, there's one right there.
Thanks. I was extremely excited to hear from Mimi tonight. And I bring this up because I was living and working in LA when Lara issue 1 dropped. And I can't stress enough the excitement that brought to the design scene. I mean, naturally, all my other friends were designers, and it felt like it was all we talked about for weeks. And I think to that point, Lara filled a stereotypically void in Los Angeles for discourse on design and art. And I think really, as well in response to your provocations and to anybody else on the panel, where else do you think those gaps exist? Whether in terms of geographies or subjects or even audiences?
I mean, thank you. I don't think we've. Maybe the back up and give a little bit of the history of Lara or LA Review of Architecture. It was started a little bit as a joke. Between me and the editor, Sammy Medina. They was like, well, we kind of have this idea of maybe expanding. And I said, oh, if you bring it to LA, I'll edit it for you. And we said, all right, we'll apply for this grant. If we get this grant, we'll do a 1-sheet insert into the into the New York Review of Architecture. And that'll cover it. And the truth was that it expanded. We had something like 60 pages of architecture criticism in the first one. I think the second one's just a tiny bit tighter than that, but not by much. But we didn't anticipate the gap. Maybe this is what I'm trying to say, which was so clearly in front of us. But I think sometimes it's hard to know what is missing until something enters, and maybe this will happen in Chicago, right? Something enters the room where people feel like they have a stake in it.
I mean, what I love about Lara and Naira and N+1 is they give really good parties. You know, the parties are really good. And you know, I might make the case that the publications exist in order to support the parties. It's the other way around, right? And especially post-pandemic, and especially in a world of simulation and illusion, so much that we love and value. I think this right here, right now, this very room, it's a bit of a stiff party, right? You're all sitting up there. We're sitting down here. There's no music, but we're going to get there. We're going to get there. The age of Aquarius is coming back, Alexandra, and we're going to make this party. And not for nothing is a political party and a fun party, somehow the same word. And I think the participation in party, the plurality in party, the convening of community is, in fact, I think, the primary projects of many of these beautiful radical publications and projects. And I'm all the more grateful for tonight. I think we should have 300 of these a year, and we might begin to get somewhere. So we'll work on that grant.
And that's why the Loeb Fellows have been campaigning to open a GSD bar to continue this kind of conviviality.
Come on, Loeb Fellows. But this is plurality of action, and this is participation, and this is what we're, I think, cherishing a little bit tonight.
I think we have time for maybe a final question, if anyone's got a burning point they want to make. We have 1 minute and 33 seconds. Oh, yeah, up there.
I'll speak very fast. Bringing more voices and increasing the number of critics seems at once completely necessary and seems to demand that we leave behind the strained resources of institutions, the funding and protection that they bring along with them. So how will the multiple voices on social media, Substack, and around the table in person do their work in this state of vulnerability?
Can you say that one more time with different words?
I'm looking for a sugar daddy. Anybody?
The
Looking
last
for a
part.
sugar high.
Whatever it takes.
Do you want to sell your foot photos?
I don't think anybody wants that.
What different words would be helpful?
Oh, I don't know. I'm reflecting on your question, and I would just repeat this idea that I think something about the radical constellations of embodied presence and being in shared space and making noise at one another, like that's what we seek. We don't write to the page; we write through the page. It's person to person, and that is the mission and the constellation of the project.
But how to make a living out of it, I think, is a really crucial question. Most of us are freelance, I think, on the panel. I mean, the idea of a staff critic, it just doesn't exist anymore.
Like we are outdoor cats and mercenaries and improvisers and all the rest.
I feel like our next party should just be like, where do you get your health insurance from? And like we can, like part of me feels like critics we should be a union, just in that we're all on a family plan. Like we can all just have a family plan.
We all need to open Patreon accounts tonight, and you can all donate.
Well, the world of criticism, and to the extent that it's part of the world of journalism, shares with the Academy a civic role, a public role, right? Like we do in the absence of governance. Like that is part of our conversation, and I think the Academy in the world of criticism can create a 1 + 1 = 3 encounter where the sum is greater, and the systems of mutual support, systems of mutual care, I think are all on a continuum, and speak a little bit to what you're asking about.
I think it would be nice if academia could be more supportive of critics, and I think they want to be. It's just we're seeing like the budgets of our academia hollowed out now, so that it's even harder for them to support criticism, even if they want to. Yeah.
If academia is hollowed out, financially it is. It's actually depleted. So the question that I have, are you thinking, or what kind of innovation do you imagine is possible for you to figure out a method to monetize what you are? We're having this conversation because there's value in what you are saying. So I am really curious. And Alexandra, you said you tried so many different things, you've done so many different things. So I actually think it would be very interesting to figure out another platform, another method. And it's not in the newspaper, because we know that there are no staff writers, and that's actually a problem. But you're not going to solve that, actually. So there might be another, I just wonder, what are you all thinking about in terms of that new thing that you would actually be able to instrumentalize for your work, and ultimately then for our work?
I actually try never to think about that. But
why not? But why not? I mean, that's so interesting to actually figure that out.
I guess, it is interesting, but I don't think that that's something that I'm good at. I think that I'm good at doing what I'm doing. And if I can't do it anymore, maybe, I'll retire and make jam. I know that some people also have the facility to think about economics and platforms, but I personally don't think that I'm good at that, and thinking too much about that makes it kind of impossible to do what I actually am good at.
I do think it's a collective action problem that I have these Russian dolls that I got in St. Petersburg in the 1990s or early 2000s when it was still fun to go to Russia. And I love them. I love lining them up, and then I love putting them all inside each other. And all of these hollow dolls together make one big, fat, solid doll. Like, that lady is tough, right? And I think if we can just assemble all of our hollowed out institutions, which is the academy, which is criticism, which is all the rest, like, we'll have something. We'll have a really strong, angry Russian lady who's going to solve it, right?
I think it's interesting.
Tonight.
I find it like, first of all, I suppose maybe a symposium or a kind of gathering like this could, in a different form. I mean, I am super fascinated with this, because maybe another version of this is that maybe we're not asking you this if you don't feel that you're the right folks to let's say turn the screw on that particular question. But I'm just curious to know, like, where you are seeing the margins of this, so that maybe there are people who can take it up, because it's a very important question.
There's no margin in architecture criticism or publishing. I do think that there's. Okay, I'm going to bring up two names that are like maybe a little problematic, but like Ezra Klein and Kyle Chaka have a really good podcast episode where they talk about the hollowing out of like basically freelance journalism, and that either you were supported by legacy media or you're on Substack, and I think the rest of us exist somewhere in the middle. This is something that's on the mind of probably all journalists right now. One of the kind of solutions, which I think is uncomfortable, is that the journalist or critic has become a brand, and that brand is outsourced across all different kinds of platforms. I'm not saying that is, sort of what I want to do, but it's like you're basically need to run a one-person media company. So I don't have a solution for it, but I do see a landscape where sort of the hierarchies have a hole in the middle, and within that, I advocate for little magazines, because I've always been advocating for little magazines, and I'll do my best to support that and hope, that we can throw a party and, have a few hundred people come populate, because I will not hit, sort of millions of readership, sort of at a legacy media company. I don't say that to be depressed. I just say it because I think we're all operating within this condition.
I just think it's going to require philanthropy. I think it's my friend Christopher Hawthorne, some of you probably know, just started a publication called Punch List. Highly recommended. It's like, $6 a month or something like that. But there's only so many $6 a month people are going to support, and even that, is not necessarily enough for a writer to live on. And again, I completely agree with Alexandra. It's not fair to ask a critic to invent, every critic to invent some new platform to exist. It's like we live in this world. We live in a world like this world with umpteen numbers of billionaires. This is what our system has created, and we need that, that puts us in a position, whether we like it or not, that we need help to do what we do.
Any philanthropists watching on the live stream?
We need institutional help. Yeah, but I mean, that's just, I think it sucks, basically. Thank you very much.
Amen.
A beautiful note to end on. We're all going off to build our gigantic Russian doll. But thank you to Anjulie, Alexandra, Thomas, Mark, and Mimi. And thank you all for being here.